All right, welcome everyone to the latest episode of Headlines and History. I'm starting to lose count now. I don't know where we are. 32, 33, something like that. Thanks for joining me. I appreciate it. If you can tell here on YouTube, I've got the old Bills shirt on. I went out to the game with family members this past weekend when the Bills beat up on the Titans a little bit. Had a good time. Beautiful, beautiful weekend in Buffalo. What a gorgeous. I think it was like 72 degrees, 69 degrees or something at the stadium, not a cloud in the sky. How amazing. But nonetheless, you're not here for that. Here's what I'm going to do this week. First, let me remind everybody, right, still in the business, but I don't speak for the DOD. I don't speak for the U.S. Army. I don't speak for the Army National Guard. I'm only here to speak for myself. And what I want to speak about this week is the intelligence community as a whole. And what triggered my thought was there's a potential, it looks like it might not even be a potential, it looks like there is a leak now. I'm recording here just on Tuesday, right before the day we drop. And a leak out of the IC, so the intelligence community, as it relates to Israel's potential response to Iran in their current back and forth. And all indications look like there is this leak of highly classified, looks like top secret information, and potentially collected by the NGA and NSA together, and what we'd call an all-source product, or at least multidiscipline product. And nonetheless, there's a whole slew of information online, rhetoric, more accurately said, about what the leak means, how it's most likely politically motivated, how it's all about President Biden and Vice President Harris, and they're trying to make the Trump campaign look bad, and they're trying, and make Prime Minister Netanyahu look silly, and all these other things. And so it just got me thinking as to maybe I would do an episode on what intelligence leaks are, how they really come about, and what they are typically meant for, right? What's the purpose behind the leaks? And then it got me thinking even deeper, and that is about what we've covered on the show in the past, and if I've even really ever covered what the intelligence community is. And, for those that are in the military that listen to the podcast, clearly you'll have an idea of what the IC is, particularly if you're in the IC, whether that's in the military, the civilian world. So, bear with me as I go through some of this stuff, as it's likely going to sound, juvenile and basic and whatever. But I know there's a whole bunch that don't have that experience. I know there's civilians that have never even been in the military that listen to the show. And I often reference examples that have occurred in the past, right? Events that have occurred, and how the IC is involved, and what the NSA is versus the NGA, and what are those two different? Are they two different agencies? Like what do they do? And there's a whole slew of other things. And then just yesterday, we've had an update to a certain process that the intelligence community goes through, and that's intelligence, DOD in particular, DOD intelligence support to law enforcement. We have had an update to the manual. It's 5240.01. And there are a DOD directive, is what it's called, a DODD. And there's been rhetoric online that the language that has changed in this updated directive, that hasn't been changed in a few years now. I want to say 2014 or something, but nonetheless, recently released, now allows DOD personnel to use lethal force against American citizens. And of course, since we're only a couple of weeks out from the election, that the rhetoric is that, of course, this violence, this authority now is going to somehow allow for violence, again, against voters or voting machines, and the DOD is going to get involved, which means the U.S. Army is going to get involved. Just silly stuff in my mind. And so I want to talk about that update as well. I'm going to get after that a little bit and provide you some context. I work with the 5240.01 almost every day in the job that I do on the Army side. And I can provide, it's all unclassified. There's nothing secret about it. It's a DOD directive that's tied in with law, federal law in particular. And And it's actually a directive that's meant to protect the American citizen, what we call U.S. persons, whether that be citizens that are people or businesses that are incorporated in the United States, and what the DoD does to protect their constitutional rights. And we have all of these frameworks built in to say, we can do these certain things at this time, but we'll never do these things. And if we have to do this thing and it's existential or exigent, then we have to go all the way to the president or whatever, right? These are all safeguards built in, and it's not what's being portrayed as the opposite, and that is somehow an opening of authority or a broadening of authority that allows DOD just start, conducting lethal attacks against American citizens. It's not the case. So I thought this might be a good opportunity to have this basic conversation and provide some general awareness as to what intelligence is, what the difference is between civilian and military, how they interact, maybe a little bit of the history. And so as we go forward in this show, that listeners who are not experienced in IC will be able to put things together more easily. And maybe they'll pick up on some acronyms that I forget to spell out as we go forward, because it's just part of my vernacular, right? So where do we start? Let's start, as we often do, right, in the history angle. It wasn't really until post-World War II that the United States developed a comprehensive, let's call it robust, structured intelligence apparatus, right, that supported the president's intelligence collection requirements. And when I say the president, I mean because the intelligence collection responsibilities that are within the U.S. government are within the executive branch. That's the purview of the president. The military falls under the executive branch. The protection of the homeland falls under the executive branch. Law enforcement falls under the executive branch. Clearly, intelligence collection falls under the executive branch. And so all of the Secretary of Defense and those related, the Secretary of Homeland Security, and which we'll get into a little bit. And again, all of these other agencies, the military component heads, they all fall under the executive branch, which again is ultimately the responsibility of the president. So, of course, the president has advisors, and that's why he or she has a cabinet, all of these things. But it's in the executive branch. And anyways, it's not like intelligence collection didn't exist prior to World War II. I mean, you could go all the way back. First of all, intelligence collection's been, it's as old as time throughout all nations, all groups, all the time. From the basic tribal, nomadic time when humans are running around on the prairie, if you will. Then one member of your tribe is spying on another member down the road, and we're in the other end of the forest, and nonetheless, right? That's intelligence collection. And we've been doing it in the history of the United States. We had Washington spies. There was a famous show that was multiple episodes. I even think multiple seasons, called Turn, which kind of dramatized the intelligence collectors at Washington's disposal during the Revolution. And you can go into the Civil War, when we first started to get involved in what we would now call imagery collection, imagery analysis, which was we had hot air balloons, sometimes that were tethered to the ground. And I think there's even a famous picture of Abraham Lincoln in one of them. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's the case. Anyways, they raised above the ground, and then they can look multiple valleys over, and they can see what enemy formations were doing. And so there's always been an element of intel collection. There's always been people taking pictures or humans collecting and listening to other conversations. But it really didn't come into, again, a structured framework until post-World War II. And it all started, at least in the human intelligence collection, with the OSS, so the Office of Strategic Services. This was an entity that in World War II was part of the military, and was designed with, or was designed to rather, collect as much information on the enemy as they could by using spies and infiltrating human sources and running confidential informants and trying to gather as much information as they could. That eventually found itself to be the CIA eventually. And after the formation of the CIA post World War II, as technology got better, more and more intelligence agencies popped up and were codified, given directors, and given certain responsibilities within their lane to be able to manage the vast amounts of data that the United States was able to gather on its adversaries, on foreign countries. And there was a big change when Executive Order 12333 came out during President Reagan's administration, which basically enshrined the delineation between military intelligence, the intelligence community, and its focus on foreign threats and foreign affairs, and law enforcement, and what law enforcement's duties were, or duties are rather, and where that separation is and where those responsibilities lie. And then there was kind of another change, another reorganization in the years following 9/11 because of some of the faults that were identified in the 9/11 Commission, and how we could have done things better, potentially have had more information on what 9/11 could have been, or what 9/11 was, and we had some changes there. So, and it eventually got us to where we are today. And what does that mean? It means that we have, in the United States, we have basically 3 separate components. There are 18 total organizations that are considered within the intelligence community. We refer to it as the IC. If you're in the IC, you know you're in the IC. And what it means is that you're part of an agency, again, whether that be civilian or military, that has a directive from the president to conduct intelligence collection on foreign adversaries, most of the time on foreign soil, sometimes on domestic soil if they're foreign threats. Sometimes they cross if you're dealing with the FISA court, something a little bit different, and if you're dealing with the FBI, which has a law enforcement component to it. But most of the time, we're talking about intelligence collection on foreign adversaries, generally speaking, overseas. And they fall into 3 categories. So there's 2 at the top, which are completely independent agencies, and that's ODNI, so that's the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and then the Central Intelligence Agency. So ODNI and CIA. Those are intelligence collection agencies, specifically independent. They don't answer really to anybody else but the National Security Council and the president, and they're responsible for a lot of different things. We'll get into some specifics in a couple of minutes. Then there's another category, which is intelligence agencies that fall under the Department of Defense. So DoD being as large as it is, it doesn't really have an intelligence collection component that's singular, independent, with a focus on all things. Right? We don't have that. It's broken down, as I had said, into 9 different organizations, and I'm going to list them out here. So the first you have is the Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA. And again, I'm going to talk about these independently so we get an understanding, so you get an understanding of why these agencies exist and what their particular focus is. There's a lot of conversation out there about, there's 18 agencies. What the hell? How could we need 18 agencies? Well, this is complicated stuff. We have an entire world, if you will, to pay attention to. And there's different authorities granted by Congress, even though under the direction of the president, and we'll get into it. But there's really a need for all of them. So, okay, DoD, 9 entities, 9 organizations. The first is the Defense Intelligence Agency. The next is the National Security Agency, the NSA. That's been in the news 100 times. Go back to 100 times, a million times. Go back to Edward Snowden. Everyone knows, or everyone should know, who the NSA is. The NGA, this one isn't so well known. It's the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. There's NRO, which is one that is often forgot about, but this is the National Reconnaissance Office, and they deal with satellites in particular. And then you have the separate military intelligence components of each service. So you have an intelligence component to the Army, to the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, and the Space Force. Right? So those services each have their own intelligence collection duties and entities. Right? And myself, as I've said numerous times on the podcast, I'm a member of the Army intelligence community. So I tie in, as does everybody else in the military, I tie into the greater intelligence community. But my job is to focus on whatever it is that the Army needs to do its mission. I'm here to answer, and my team and my assets and all these things, we're here to answer and fill intelligence gaps for commanders as it relates to the Army mission. And the Air Force does it for the Air Force mission, and the Marine Corps, and on and on and on. Okay. The third group, umbrella group, if you will, of intelligence community agencies are separate departments. And these are agencies that have a broad mandate to do something specific. But when I say broad, I mean there's an intelligence collection component inside of it. Okay. Unlike ODNI and the CIA, which I mentioned earlier, they are intel agencies only. Their whole existence is related to intelligence collection. These agencies that I'm going to describe here in Group 3, their existence is not solely about intelligence collection. They have a greater mission, but they have an IC component as part of them. Okay, and these agencies are the Department of Energy. Right, they have what's called the Office of Intelligence and Counterintelligence. We have the Department of Homeland Security, and their IC component is the Intelligence and Analysis Unit. They have the Coast Guard Intelligence. That is separate from DoD because of its maritime, really littoral responsibilities, and it just made more sense when there was a restructuring after 9/11 to leave the Coast Guard in these other agencies. That's okay. Just understand that's why that's there. We have the Department of Justice's, Bureau of Investigation. We have the Drug Enforcement Administration's Office of National Security Intelligence, and I'm reading these here because I want to make sure I get them right. And by the way, it's the Drug Enforcement Administration, not the Drug Enforcement Agency. That's a pet peeve of mine since I worked there. Department of State's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. Right? Then you have the Department of Treasury's Office of Intelligence and Analysis. Right? So those are the agencies, again, that have a broad mandate to do a lot of things. Treasury does a lot of things, but it has an intelligence component. The DEA has a responsibility to conduct international and domestic narcotics investigations, but the DEA also regulates controlled substances and works with doctors' offices and other things. So they have a lot of responsibilities, but ultimately they do have this component, this intelligence component, right? So I explained to you already, as you might imagine, what the military IC components are, right? When you send the Army to do something, and the Army being, quote unquote, the Army, some component of the Army. You send the 18th Airborne Corps, for example, you send them overseas to conduct some type of an operation against a foreign adversary. The 18th Airborne Corps has intelligence gaps, that we call them. They have questions that the commander needs answered in order to fulfill, to meet the mission, in order to get the job done. And so he or she, whoever's in command of the 18th Airborne Corps at this moment, has at their disposal a bunch of intelligence analysts, separate capabilities and assets that they can use to do all of the stuff, right? Make all the sausage, if you will, generate all these reports and provide all of these analyses to the commander so the commander can win the fight. The Air Force does the same thing. The Marine Corps does the same thing. So that's what those IC elements are for, right? So those are easy to understand. Let's go, though, and talk quickly about some of the individual components and what makes them different, right? Specifically, there's a lot of confusion between ODNI and CIA, these two agencies that have very specific but only intel responsibilities. So let me read it directly from the DNI site. Okay, that's where I'm going to get these explanations because again, I want to make sure that I'm saying it correctly and I'm not just giving you my, my experience and blabbering here as to what I think the CIA really does. Okay, the Central Intelligence Agency is responsible for providing national security intelligence to senior U.S. policymakers. That's ultimately what the CIA does. Policymakers need intel, and their lead agency for intelligence for policymakers is CIA. The CIA is also responsible for mainly the U.S. government's ability to collect human intelligence. So they run sources. Right? Now, the CIA can do other things. It has access to other capabilities. Right? It's not like the CIA, let's say, can run a source and has no idea how to gather information, imagery information, or images from satellites. That's not true. But generally, the lead agency for human collection, running sources, doing those things for the U.S. government is the CIA. And they're ultimately responsible to the U.S. policymakers. That's their lane, right? Generally speaking. The Coast Guard, broad responsibilities include protecting citizens from the sea, protecting America from threats delivered by the sea, and protecting the sea itself, which they call maritime stewardship. That is its responsibility. Okay? The DIA, we talked about this. This is the Defense Intelligence Agency. This is one of those DoD components that's not within the military. The Defense Intelligence Agency is a Department of Defense combat support agency. With more than 16,500 military and civilian employees, DIA is a major producer and manager of foreign military intelligence and provides military intelligence to warfighters, defense policymakers, and force planners in the DoD and IC. Again, and it's in support of military planning. So basically, the DIA is the overall encompassing defense intelligence community capability that, again, answers to the SecDef. So the CIA doesn't answer to the SecDef. The CIA is its own agency that answers to the president, right, through the National Security Council, which we'll talk about. The DIA is a DoD intel collection agency. It's specifically providing strategic level intelligence to warfighters as they conduct those wars. Right? The Department of Energy, they have a separate intel collection capability. The Department of Energy's Office of Intelligence and Counterintelligence is responsible for the intelligence and counterintelligence activities throughout the Department of Energy complex, including nearly 30 intelligence and counterintelligence offices nationwide. The mission is to protect and enable and represent the vast scientific brain trust in DOE's laboratories and plants. Done. So why does the Department of Energy need an intelligence collection capability? People ask that online a lot. It's like, what's Treasury need one? Well, what's DOE need one? Because the United States government has a responsibility to protect the information that we've gathered or that the studies, conclusions that we've made through study, and all the energy infrastructure related to the government itself. That's under the purview of DOE. And so DOE has the ability to collect intelligence to make sure that that stuff's protected. That's not the DOD's mandate. You're not going to use the CIA, which is a foreign human intelligence collection capability for policymakers. You're not going to use the DIA. The DIA is a warfighting intelligence collection component. Can't use them. So who's going to do the intelligence collection for DOE? So they have that component built in. Now, you might say to yourself, and we'll talk about this a little bit when we get into our next agency here, which is the Department of Homeland Security. You may say to yourself, well, we have Homeland Security, and if the Department of Energy is in the homeland, why would we need a whole separate intel collection capability within DOE when we could just button it in under DHS? Now, theoretically, that could be true. But you could also say the same thing for the FBI. And you could say, well, what's the FBI need an intelligence collection capability for? It's part of the homeland. Just put them under DHS. The problem with that is, again, there are so many responsibilities out there from protecting our agriculture to protecting energy, to protecting military assets, to protecting our politicians, to protecting industry, helping protect foreign adversaries not stealing information from SpaceX and Elon Musk and his team. There's so many responsibilities that there's a tradecraft, there's an experience and an expertise that's built when you're focusing on one avenue or one lane, if you will. Right? If you're responsible in your agency for protecting infrastructure and making sure that the enemy, our adversaries, are not collecting and going to cause havoc on our dams and our rail infrastructure and our road infrastructure, which is stuff that China's doing as we speak. If you're good at that, you have an experience in that, you have all of the knowledge within your agency of where that infrastructure is and how it operates, then it only makes sense to have an intelligence collection capability within that agency. It's the same thing with DOE. The Department of Energy knows where all of its energy infrastructure is. It knows where all of its scientists are. It knows all the things it's responsible for. And so keep the intel collection capability, again, I keep using that word, but that's really what it is, that a capability and authority within DOD. It just makes the most sense. Okay, now we have Homeland Security. The Office of Intelligence and Analysis under Department of Homeland Security is responsible for using information and intelligence from multiple sources to identify and assess current and future threats to the U.S. Done. It is ultimately responsible, and there are sub-agencies within DHS like Border Patrol, but they don't have their own collection. Just DHS does. And they're protecting the homeland. This is an agency that came up after 9/11. We'll talk about that. Department of State. They have their own responsibilities. The Intelligence and Research subset group, right, the IC capability for state, provides the Secretary of State with timely, objective analysis on global developments as well as real-time insights from all source intelligence. The Secretary of State, I'm going to give you an explanation here. The Secretary of State has a different mission than the Department of Defense, the Secretary of Defense. So it makes more sense for the Department of State, when the Secretary of State's traveling, let's say, to embassies all over the world, he or she might want to know, hey, what are the threats to the embassies specifically all over the world? I'm not necessarily concerned. I'll give you an example. So the Secretary of State's traveling to Kuwait, and he's like, listen, I'm going to be spending a couple of weeks in Kuwait. I want to know what the current threat picture is on all of our embassy in Kuwait, any consulates we may have. And so when I'm there, I want to know, what's the threat level? What's the focus? And I need my people to give me that answer. It only makes sense, again, for the Secretary, the Intelligence and Research folks in the Department of State to do that work and analysis, not the DOD, right? Not the DIA, who's focusing on the warfighter. Right? I think you're starting to get the point. Department of Treasury. The Office of Intelligence and Analysis was established by the Intelligence Authorization Act of 2004. OIA is responsible for the receipt, analysis, collation, and dissemination of foreign intelligence and foreign counterintelligence information related to the operation and responsibilities of the Department of Treasury. Listen, there's money everywhere. And we all know that money laundering is key to many illicit activities, and Treasury has its hand on all of that knowledge. They know where the banks are. They know how the money's transferred. They know how money transfers work. They know how finance works. That's what Treasury is all about. And so I said here that this is an agency that popped up, not the agency itself, but the intel piece of this agency popped up in 2004. That came out of the 9/11 Commission, where we realized we didn't have enough focus on the money transfers across the world when it came to supporting international terrorism. We needed somebody to really kind of dig down into the weeds here, really pay attention to the ones and zeros and the dollar signs, because we're missing things. We're missing transfers. We're missing where all of Hezbollah's money is. We need to pay attention to this. And so an intelligence agency was built under Treasury in order to make that happen. Right? The Drug Enforcement Administration. Those intel folks are focused on where all the narcotics are coming from. They're dealing with organized crime, foreign organized crime. They're dealing with the cartels. The analysts at the State Department don't have time for that. They don't have time to be chasing down all the cartels in Mexico to find out where all the fentanyl is. The DEA can do that. FBI, this one's a little funky. The FBI has a foreign intelligence collection responsibility as it relates to threats that are domestic. Right? The NYPD, I'm just going to give you an aside here. The NYPD has police officers all over the world, and they do conducting investigations. You can call it sometimes intelligence, which is different than an investigation. Maybe someday we'll get into those differences, but they're doing intel or investigative collection, whatever that is. If they find people that are trying to do damage to New York City, they have the legal authority to do that. Again, they're not out there conducting warfighter analysis. They're not collecting information on what the Iranians are doing. But if somebody's going to blow up buildings in New York City, NYPD wants to be involved in trying to hunt down those threats. And if they can build that correlation, if they can build a tie between a threat and the city, they can do that. Same with the FBI. If there's an organized crime entity that maybe half of the organization is in Atlanta and the other half of the organization is in Mexico, the FBI has an intelligence collection component that can gather information. Again, there's a difference between intelligence and investigative information. It's complicated stuff, and we'll get into it at another time. But just know they can collect this information that can help them their investigations. Okay. Again, as it focuses on the domestic. Right. The National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. This is one of my favorites. This agency, as I had said, is specific for intel. It's mainly what they do. They just do intelligence work, mainly. And they provide timely, relevant, and accurate geospatial intelligence in support of national security objectives. Okay. Their job is to analyze, to help collect and analyze images from across the globe. And what we mean by geospatial is then applying data to those images to give the data context. Okay, so if they take, for example, if the NGA has access to a satellite image, and the image is a picture of a military base in Iran, okay, there's analysts at NGA that can do an analysis of that image alone and count vehicles and say, well, here's a building. This looks like an energy building. There's a smokestack with black smoke coming out. That looks like a coal plant, right? Maybe that's the power for the base, blah, blah, blah. And they can do an analysis on just that image. But also, there are other capabilities out there where we can gather separate data layers and apply it to the image to give the image context. So, for example, let's say that we can use LiDAR. LiDAR is a laser-based collection that allows allows assets to see through clouds and other things that you wouldn't be able to see with what we call an electrical optical or IR infrared sensor. Because that's just like taking an image with a regular camera. If there's clouds in the way, you can't see it. Right? So you can use LiDAR again, which is a laser-based collection, and it can, because if it's different place on the light spectrum, it can see through these weather patterns. Nonetheless, LiDAR can also give you distance. And so if you're looking at an image, okay, and you see that there's a wall around this military base that you're looking in the image, LiDAR will be able to give you the answer, potentially, as to maybe how tall that wall is. So it's just a layer of data, but we'll apply that layer on top of the image, and it'll say, okay, not only is this a wall, it's a 9-foot wall or a 15-foot wall or whatever the capability currently is. Okay. And there's more than just that. It's not just LiDAR. There's all these other things. Ground movement target indicators, GMTI, that comes from other capabilities, but nonetheless, data on top of images, right? Then there's NRO. NRO is interesting because National Reconnaissance Office, because it doesn't really do intelligence collection per se, or let me say that differently. It doesn't really do intelligence analysis per se, okay? The National Reconnaissance Office designs, builds, and operates the nation's reconnaissance satellites. That's the foundational responsibility of the NRO. Their products, provided to an expanding list of customers like the CIA, the Department of Defense, can warn of potential trouble spots around the world, help plan military operations, and monitor the environment. Okay, so they their mandate isn't the same as the NGA, which is really an analysis-driven agency. NGA does not control satellites. They don't own them. It uses the satellite images that are provided to them by the NRO in order to provide assessments to, again, policymakers, people in the military, whatever. The NRO can collect information, again, because they're the ones that own the satellites, but they don't get into the weeds in the same way that the NGA will. They can provide what we call indicators and warnings, which is exactly what we just said here. It said that can warn of potential trouble spots around the world. What that means is provides indicators and warnings. General basic stuff that's like, hey, I just took an image of Russia in some location, and we just noticed that the last time we took an image, there was an entire tank division located in location X. And then we went back and we saw it again and another satellite, whatever, whenever it comes again. And now that division's gone, right? Just to give you a very basic description. The NRO can provide that as an indicator and warning and say, the Russians have moved an entire tank brigade from location X to location Y. What does that mean? I don't know. Could be nothing, but nonetheless, it will provide that information. Oh boy. And then we have the NSA. The NSA, the often controversial National Security Agency. Okay. The National Security Agency is the nation's cryptologic organization that coordinates, directs, performs highly specialized activities, very true, to protect U.S. information systems and produce foreign signals intelligence information. It's a highly technical organization. It's the forefront of communications and information technology. That's definitely true. What does NSA do? Okay. So when we're talking about the intelligence community and all of these different responsibilities, there are intelligence, what we call disciplines, inside might not be the best term, which are avenues through which you can gather information. Okay. I said to you earlier that the CIA does human intelligence. And what that means is you can gather information from humans. Humans can tell you a lot of things. That is all the way down to the simplest thing like you have a spy and a spy tells you something. That's human intelligence. And that's one intelligence discipline. And we call the human intelligence field one intel discipline. Then you have imagery intelligence, which is what I just told you about from the NGA. You collect pictures of things. It could be as simple as a camera of somebody taking a picture. It could all the way up to satellites, right? You're taking images. And geospatial intelligence tied into that. We really just call it geospatial now because we do so much more than just images. But nonetheless, that's one discipline. Then you have foreign instrument intelligence, FISINT, which is basically within the NSA's purview. Then you have signals intelligence, which generally speaking is just an umbrella term for ELINT and COMET, which are electronic intelligence, and communications intelligence, which, COMET, as you can imagine, how you communicate between entities or personnel via signals, or electronic communication between persons or entities or assets via signals. The NSA is responsible for that. And those responsibilities have grown since the advent of the internet, as you might imagine, because there's communication via signals that are happening in the cyber world. And so the NSA is responsible for that too. They do radar intelligence for the military and for the president and other things. So that's the NSA. We're not going to get into all the controversial stuff. That's for a different podcast. But that's where they lie. Okay. So another thing I want to make clear here too is that, so obviously these agencies have these different responsibilities. But the reason that the military folks, and this, I would include myself in this, the reason the military folks have an understanding of the intelligence community as a whole, maybe a little bit differently, and I would even potentially argue better, a more refined understanding than some of the other agencies, is because the military relies on all these other agencies when they're doing their own work. So you may have an analyst within the Department of Treasury, for example, who's doing financial analysis on money laundering in Bahrain. Okay, they may have very little understanding of what the NSA does. Their paths don't cross, and if they've never been in the military, they likely have no idea how the Navy does intelligence or how the Air Force does intelligence. But and that could be true for a lot of people within these different agencies. But the military, they have certain capabilities within the DoD infrastructure, but they rely upon all the other agencies to provide them analysis and data, what we call from a strategic perspective, to support the warfighter on the ground. So military intelligence analysts, we have an understanding of what the CIA does. Work with them. I have an understanding of what the NSA does. Work with them. As a matter of fact, in order for the Army to do signals intelligence, it has to be connected to the NSA. That's for another topic. But nonetheless, I know what DIA does because we're relying on DIA all the time for our foreign military capabilities analysis, right? So, and the military in and of itself is kind of looking at the battle space or the area of operations that sits within their purview. It sits within their world. They don't have the satellites, an infantry division, the 18th, or rather the 82nd Airborne Division. They don't own satellites. They have whatever capabilities, tactical warfighting capabilities within their own structure. They don't have satellites. And they're not running sources throughout the entire world. Okay? The CIA runs sources throughout the entire world. So the CIA can provide intelligence analysis. They can provide indicators and warnings through their sources to the 82nd Airborne if the 82nd Airborne is deployed to Russia, if we're conducting let's say we're at war with Russia, right? Just as an example. And the DIA could be doing all of this work on what the military capacity and capabilities are of the entire Russian military. It could provide whatever the 82nd Airborne needs in that space while it's conducting the fight. Okay, so the military actually has a pretty good idea of what the rest of the IC does because they use the rest of the IC when they're fighting downrange, we call it. The other reason I would say that is just other than the obvious, like I just explained, that the military doesn't have the capabilities that all of these other agencies have, right? We don't have satellites in the Army in particular. The other reason we do that is because at the end of the day, intelligence collection is to protect the homeland and win our nation's wars. Why else would the president need that information? Why would the executive branch need to know what's happening across the entire world if we didn't feel like there was either a threat to the homeland or we had the need to win a war? And so the warfighter, ultimately at the end of the day, minus a few onesies and twosies here and there, they're the ultimate customer. It's the soldier on the ground, ultimately through multiple levels, obviously, of command, but it's the soldier on the ground that we're supporting when the NSA is collecting and the CIA is collecting and NGA is assessing satellite stuff. All of this stuff, it's for the military to fight and win our nation's wars. If we didn't have to have wars, we wouldn't have the intelligence collection capability. We wouldn't need it, but that's not the world that we live in. And unfortunately, it just is what it is. Now, you might ask, but not everybody else in the world has all of this stuff. And my answer to that would be a lot of Western countries do. They might not be as large. They might not have as many people as the United States does. But many countries have similar capabilities. Again, just maybe not as big. And the other thing is, and this is something I've said in the past, and I'll continue to say, whether we like it or not, in today's world, the United States chose, our grandparents, if you're my age, chose post-World War II to be the foundational security for the world, post-World War II. And you may not agree with that. You may not think it's a good idea. You may think it's a waste of money. You may think that 18 intelligence agencies, even though I've explained all of this and told you where everyone has its own lane, and there's a reason why we have all this, so much information out there, you may say to yourself, well, who really cares? Let's just be isolationist and not pay attention, and we'll just go back in our hole, right? Maybe, I would grant you, maybe post-World War II, we could have made that decision. in 1946 and just said, forget it. We're done. We're done getting involved in Europe's wars, even though we were attacked by Japan in 41. We're done getting involved in anybody else's stuff. We want nothing to do with it. And we're not going to get involved. But again, that's not the decision we made. And so now here we are in 2024. I'm born into an environment in the late 70s that just exists. It is what it is. We're collecting intelligence on everybody. They're collecting intelligence on us. Israel's collecting on us. We're collecting on Israel. Just, it's what we do. And so we got to make the best of it. And so now let's just do the best job we can to protect the homeland, fight and win our nation's wars, and hopefully keep somewhat of a peace globally so we can keep commerce flowing and we can raise the standard of living for everybody in the world. That's ultimately the goal. Now, I don't want to get into this huge conversation about how that may not be the case, and you may think the United States is the great Satan and we're doing everything wrong. But okay, maybe I'm not here to stomp the ground and say that the United States is perfect and we do everything right. But generally speaking, that's the case, right? The global order was designed post World War II, and the United States made a decision that we were going to get involved, build a massive military, and we were going to generate peace through strength. That was what we were going to do, and we did it. And so that's why we have all these intelligence agencies. And they're very useful, and they're very good at what they do. They're not perfect, but they're very good at what they do. Okay, so when I say I see, that's what I mean. I'm talking about these intelligence agencies. I'm talking about this community that works together. It has its own, each one has its own mandate. Each one has its own intelligence discipline, if you will, to focus on. They all support the warfighter, and they all work together. There are a lot of interagency capabilities. When I was in Afghanistan in 2012, we had two specific intelligence agencies that were part of my task force that worked hand in hand because they were able to determine that each one of their capabilities was unique, but when applied together, when integrated in a certain manner, they were able to do wonderful things to answer commanders' priority requirements. And so they were doing all this stuff. Okay, so they're oftentimes they integrate. They say, well, you're good at this and you're good at that, and let's get together and we'll do this stuff, right? It's called all-source analysis or multidiscipline analysis. And so a lot of these agencies work together. When there's a massive international drug trafficking investigation, you may have an interagency cooperation where the Drug Enforcement Administration is running informants into that organization. The FBI may have an informant separate from the DEA into that organization. Treasury may be working on the money laundering aspect of what that organization is doing to pass funds between the U.S. and Mexico, let's say. The NGA may be conducting satellite reconnaissance on where these organized crime groups are operating in South America, and they'll provide images and analysis to the Treasury folks and to the DEA and FBI as they conduct the investigation. They all work hand in hand. That's what they do. So when I say I see, that's what I mean. Now, a couple of items I want to talk about in particular to flesh this out. So ODNI, which I mentioned in the beginning, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, this is an agency that was formed after 9/11. And what happened was, for those of you that were around during 9/11, old enough to pay attention, there was a lot of talk about these walls. They're theoretical, they're not literal, but walls that were put up between intelligence agencies that created siloed information. And so the FBI had information it didn't share with the CIA. The CIA had information it didn't share with the DEA. And what the 9/11 Commission found out was that these walls that were generated out of nowhere, right? The agencies themselves created this. It was, it's a concept of I have the information and therefore I'm strong and I'm not going to give it away. That led us to missing things we shouldn't have missed on 9/11. And so, and at the time, at the 9/11 time, the CIA was considered the premier agency of all of the other agencies. Okay. And so much so that every single day there's a briefing that's produced. It's called the PDB, the Presidential Daily Briefing. The director of the CIA was responsible for finalizing that brief and giving it to the president. So it came, all of the information came from all of these different entities, but it was eventually correlated, combined, put into one product by the CIA director, and the director gave it to the president. That changed after 9/11 because what President Bush wanted to do is he decided that because there were so many problems between sharing information, we needed a new umbrella organization to force everybody else to work together. We needed to get rid of these silos and this history of the CIA did this and we have this history and the FBI has that history. Okay, done. New position, Director of National Intelligence. That's the boss. Everyone else falls under ODNI, and ODNI answers to the president. Done. And so when the PDB is given to the president at the end of the day, it's the Director of National Intelligence. And it's the ODNI's responsibility to ensure that everybody is playing together. They're playing nicely. Everybody is sharing the information that they should. And that position holds the authority to tell everybody else what to do. There is no side game of the CIA director doesn't like this person, and so they're not going to, it's over. And what I can say is that it took a little while for this DNI concept to really kind of find its footing, if you will, within the IC post 9/11. But now it's regular business. It's how we operate. CIA understands, FBI understands. We give the information to ODNI. ODNI presents it to the president. They're in charge. Got it. And it's working pretty well. Same concept with DHS. DHS was formed after 9/11. We didn't really have a comprehensive, Homeland Security organization. We had disparate responsibilities at the Coast Guard, who kind of did stuff, and then CBP, Border Patrol, which did certain things. So anyways, they created DHS, and DHS obviously now, again, responsible for the homeland, and they answer to ODNI. Now, the other thing that I want to talk about really quickly is what I mentioned at the outset, and that's 5240.01. So one of the things that makes intelligence collection in the United States so complicated, other than all the technical stuff, is the fact that we have a constitution. We have a constitution that mandates a separation between intelligence and investigations, between the military overseas and law enforcement here at home. And again, when I say intelligence investigation, I mean intelligence collection for overseas, generally speaking, and investigations conducted by law enforcement back home. What we don't do, and what we don't want to give the impression we do, and don't do literally at all, is use the military to spy on our own people. We don't use military assets, generally speaking, unless in exigent circumstances, and this is what 5240.01 is for, to use the military for domestic issues. That's what law enforcement's for. And we do this so we get rid of the history of all of these governments, these autocracies and dictators and monarchs who decide to just, I'm going to use the most powerful entity in my hand, which is the military 99% of the time. And so I'll just use them to collect all this information on our people, and I'll send soldiers into the street, and we'll use tanks at home. And we don't do this, right? This is not what the United States does. However, and nor should we, but it creates complications in law about what we can do and what we should do to protect the American people with the capabilities the military has that law enforcement doesn't have. And it can be as innocuous as domestic response to hurricanes. We're dealing with this issue right now in Florida. We've had the 2 hurricanes hit back to back, and you're reading online that FEMA's not doing a great job. Even though FEMA's in control of this whole thing, that's how the law works. But nonetheless, FEMA's not doing a great job. And boy, we're really relying on the military to help us out. Okay. But that's fun. That might be nice to think and say, listen, the National Guard will just come out. It's the military. They have all the capabilities. The National Guard has all the capabilities of the active duty army, right? And they were even calling for the active duty to come out. They wanted the 18th Airborne. They wanted to come out of Fort Liberty, 82nd to come out. Hey, just bring the military in. It's no big deal. The military will take care of all this stuff. Yeah, but at the same time, what the American people don't want is, hey, when we have a problem with protests, hey, just bring the military in. Hold on a second. Right now we're getting into that, wait a minute, should the government be using the military to do things domestically. Well, when it's a hurricane, okay, fine, I get it. Well, now there's protests in Baltimore. Ugh, what are we really trying to do here, right? And you may say, well, a weather event is one thing and a protest is another thing. Yeah, but sometimes those things collide. So what are you going to do when you have a weather event which turns into looting like Katrina? Okay, so you've got the military that's like flying in and pulling people off of roofs, but now you've got military assets on the ground putting old ladies in helicopters, but at the same time, right next door, people are looting and stealing other people's property and they're hurting Americans. And so now the military is the only one on the ground and law enforcement's not there. What do you do? Does the army just stand around and just say, well, listen, I'm watching this civilian beat this other civilian and take all of their money. But we can't, how do you deal with these problems? This stuff's real, right? Then you have the possibility that local law enforcement just isn't funded enough in order to take on some issue, right? Let's say there's a massive protest in some small town in small county somewhere that just doesn't have the capability. Like when we brought the National Guard in to ensure that these children during the civil rights era can go inside of their school, because even local law enforcement wouldn't pay attention to federal law. What do? There's a federal mandate. Well, we don't have a federal law enforcement source in the same way that other countries have national police forces. We have an investigative body that is the FBI, but they're not a national police force in the same sense that Russia and Iran have those. So what are you going to do? You got to bring in the military. Well, what's the military's law? Because the president's trying to get something done. A law was passed by Congress. What are we going to do? Just throw our hands up and say, well, I can't deal with it. You're going to bring the military in. So 5240 is a document that helps to delineate responsibilities in certain crises and then authorities in certain crises and what the National Guard or the active duty is allowed to do in support of law enforcement when there's a problem. All right? Technically, the title is DoD Intelligence and Intelligence-Related Activities and Defense Intelligence Component Assistant to Law Enforcement Agencies and Other Civil Authorities. Just came out on September 27th, a couple of days ago. Give or take, a couple of days ago, a few weeks ago. DoD Intelligence and Intelligence-Related Activities. Direct intelligence collection and things that are intelligence-related are a little bit different in legal terms, but just generally consider them the same here. Defense Intelligence Component Assistant, that means DoD intel folks, Army, Marines, Space Force, right? Support the law enforcement agencies and other civil authorities, like FEMA, for example, right? And this document was just updated, like I said, a couple of weeks ago. And it delineates things on how, for example, in this one paragraph, this document, for example, does not apply to activities conducted by NGA, remember the imagery geospatial folks, as it relates to humanitarian assistance, disaster readiness, maritime and aeronautical safety of navigation, environmental and security vulnerability studies, mapping, charting, and geodetic missions, and other similar activities not constituting foreign intelligence or counterintelligence. So what that means is, so we have these rules and stuff that you have to abide by, NGA in particular, but not for these things, because these things are not considered an issue for U.S. persons data. They're doing humanitarian assistance, disaster readiness. They can do those things. They can look at, hurricane patterns, for example, and determine if, hurricanes are going to cause issues to the homeland, right? That's just one example of some of the stuff that's in here, right? There's a lot of legalese, but let me give you the one paragraph that came up as a real concern. And the reason I wanted to highlight it quickly in here, that's been bouncing all over the internet. There's a paragraph called Levels of Authority. And in here, it's saying, again, delineating is really the word, which activities can be conducted by who if the right authority is given. There are some things, some situations where the military can respond and do X with a certain level of authority. And then there are other situations where the military can't do anything unless the president says so. And the paragraph in question is one of those scenarios. I'm going to read it word for word because it matters. Right? This is a directive that's written by lawyers, so quite literally every word matters. DoD needs Secretary of Defense approval if We are going to provide assistance in responding with assets with potential for lethality or any situation in which it is reasonably foreseeable. Reasonably foreseeable is a legal term. Right? Reasonably foreseeable means that if you were to, it's the reasonable person standard you'd find in U.S. courts. If a reasonable person thought, an average citizen on the street thought that it was foreseeable that providing the requested assistance may involve the use of force, or that is likely to result in lethal force, including death or serious bodily injury. Assistance in responding with assets with potential for lethality or any situation in which is reasonably foreseeable that providing the requested assistance may involve the use of force that is likely to result in lethal force, including death or serious bodily injury. It also includes all support to civilian law enforcement officials in situations where a confrontation between civil law enforcement and civilian individuals or groups is reasonably anticipated. Such use of force must be in accordance with another DoD directive, which is the use of force directive. It's DoD 521056, potentially as further restricted based on the specifics of the requested support. So basically what that means is more restrictions may apply. But there's two sentences in here, and let's break them down really quickly. I know we're getting on to the hour. What does sentence number 1 really mean? Assistance in responding with assets with potential for lethality. What they mean is with the proliferation of UAS platforms, with the ability for the DoD, with the not the ability, but with the access the Department of Defense has to unmanned aerial systems which provide reconnaissance and surveillance downrange, that if requested for a specific need domestically, that if a certain DoD UAS platform happened to be armed, that platform could respond if the Secretary of Defense said so. This is not something that's approved at the commander level. You're not able to ask some 2-star or 3-star general somewhere. This has to come directly from the Secretary of Defense. And that office is going to say, for whatever reason, you can or you cannot do this thing. You cannot provide this asset to local law enforcement. And they can do it with SecDef approval. And if the requested assistance may involve the use of force that is likely to result in lethal force, including death or serious bodily injury. Okay. It also includes support to civilian law enforcement officials in situations where a confrontation between civil law enforcement and civilian individuals or groups is reasonably anticipated. What does that mean? The DoD has to receive SecDef approval. You can't use the National Guard command structure. You can't use the 82nd Airborne Commander. It has to be the SecDef that says you can use a military component to respond to this city if there are civilian law enforcement conducting counter riot activity with civilians themselves, because that's a playground for potential lethal force. And what we don't want to be showing the American people, because it's not in our business, is that the civilian law enforcement can't handle civilians themselves, and so we're bringing in the military. We're rolling the tanks down the street, right? The Army's coming in to take care of it all. That's not how we operate as a government. It's not how we want to operate. However, if you don't have the provision in here to allow for that in exigent circumstances, we could run into a scenario where there's absolute chaos. And we'll be in a similar scenario as we are with the hurricanes, where FEMA is supposedly, according to people on the ground, right? They're not doing the job that they had expected, these civilians had expected, so they want the Army to come in. The same could be true if, let's say, some riot breaks out and civilians are being killed and law enforcement can't handle it and the city's being burned to the ground. And quite literally, the only entity that could stop this from spreading was a military entity. You don't want local commanders on the street saying, yeah, get in there, handle business. Because we don't use the military, again, 99% of the time for local law enforcement. But there are those onesie and twosie scenarios where if things go really sideways, the American people want that support from the military. They're going to want it. And we cannot be in a position where we in the DoD clasp our hands together and say, we are hogtied. We can do nothing. We can literally not respond because the military plays zero role anytime ever in a domestic response. That's not what we're here for either. So this is the challenge with working in a government with our constitutional framework. You can't prevent all the bad things without giving some of the authority. So it is technically true that some of these knuckleheads online are saying, oh my God, there's a new paragraph in 5240. The government's going to come and start using the military to kill everybody. Listen, clearly that's not the case. But it does have to write in there, it has to be written in some way that allows for the military to respond. Again, in this exigent circumstance, it's got to be written in the legal authority or we never could. And so we can't have it both ways. We can't say no all the time and yes all the time. We have to walk that line because we cannot plan for every single scenario. We can't literally write a document with, 30,000 scenarios and say, okay, column A, military doesn't respond. Column B, military does. And then we just write all of these things down. Well, what if this guy shows up with this law enforcement and this bomb? No, he can't. Okay, we can't do that. No. What if the hurricane has this and then it's this? Okay, yes, we can respond. No, we can't respond. It doesn't work that way. The law is not written that way. State law is not written that way. Federal law is not written that way. You cannot plan for every single scenario. So you have to be able to write it in such a way that it restricts the use of the military down to the most, again, exigent of circumstances, but allows for that one time when you may need them. Because eventually, that day may come. Right? Katrina may come, and you need to call out the 82nd Airborne, who comes out to pull people off rooftops while they're watching looters. And what are they going to do? All right. So listen, this document here is not designed 2 weeks before the election, so the Harris campaign can go out and kill Americans. That's just not how it works. All right. So I hope I'm able to put you all at ease for anybody who's thinking that. No. All right. So I went a little long today, but I thought this was useful. All right. Let me know. Give me some feedback. Headlinesinhistory.com. Shoot me an email. Jon Molik at Headlines in History. Let me know if this was useful or wasn't useful, or if we could do it again, if I could expand on some other things. But I thought it was a good idea. I think everybody, deserve to know, as we keep talking about Intel going forward, that everybody deserves to know what the IC is, how it operates, and what it all means. And hopefully you can use this information as we go forward in our journey here on the podcast to understand more clearly what this Intel thing is and what it all means as we talk about military conflict and foreign affairs. All right. So thanks again for joining me this week. Headlinesinhistory.com. You can support the show there. We're also on Patreon, Headlines in History Podcast. Got a couple interviews that are coming up. Talked to a few folks. I got a couple authors that are going to be coming on. I don't want to give you dates because I don't know exactly when, but they'll be coming out in the next few weeks, unless Russia invades Poland or something, who knows. But got a couple more coming on, and I'm going to start looking back into some of our military folks. Maybe we'll get some more colonels on the podcast, and we'll keep moving this thing forward. So thanks again for joining me this week, and we'll see everybody next week.